Welcome to Port Hope Archives History Video Series. This video will discuss the boozy history of Port Hope's brewers, distillers, and the rum-running trade out of the Port Hope Harbor. Through periods of prohibition and prosperity, the history of Port Hope's breweries and distilleries has been quite a journey. According to Ian Montagnus's book, Port Hope: A History, brewing and distilling were for many years two of Port Hope's principal industries. In fact, most of the 19th century marked a great era for brewing and distilling in the region. During this time, beer and whiskey flowed freely from the taps of local hotels and taverns. By 1844, a fledgling Port Hope had a population of around 200 people and was home to 5 distilleries and 1 brewery. After the initial settlement of Port Hope and Hope Township, early residents, such as John David Smith, were happy to buy second-rate grain from local farmers. The grain was used to make whiskey and beer, along with water from the Ganaraska River and underground springs. Another early brewer in Port Hope was John Tucker Williams. Williams was a War of 1812 veteran, father of the famous Colonel A.T.H. Williams, and the first publicly elected mayor of Port Hope. In 1817, he built a brewery on the west side of what was known as Brewery Lane. Williams's brewery was located near the site of the future St. Lawrence Hotel. In addition to Smith and Williams, other prominent names in the Port Hope brewing industry included Ambrose, Winslow, and the now nationally familiar Molson. By the 1870s, the Messrs. Ambrose and Winslow had their brewery running at full capacity on Cavan Street, north of what is now Highland Drive. This industrial effort was important to the population of Port Hope. In fact, in an 1874 edition of the Port Hope Weekly Guide, a tour of the facilities was published. Originally named Highland Spring Brewery, Ambrose and Winslow's operation consisted of several buildings and had a capacity of 5,000 barrels, or nearly 2,500 gallons of daily production value. The brewing water was supplied by natural spring, and the energy was provided by a steam engine built by Nicholas and Company, also of Port Hope. Apart from being a profitable business venture, brewing in Port Hope was also a popular pastime for prominent residents throughout the middle of the 19th century. That is, until the turbulent time of Prohibition hit Port Hope. Prohibition was an attempt by various levels of government to restrict the selling and consumption of alcoholic beverages, and this area was no exception. In 1885, the Council of the United Counties of Northumberland and Durham conducted a vote, wherein they decided to disallow the sale of alcoholic beverages in public houses. The movement was due to the Federal Temperance Act and resulted in the closure of no less than half of Port Hope's taverns. While the Canadian Encyclopedia notes that Prohibition was too short-lived for real success, the results in Port Hope were swift and far-reaching. After Prohibition, the last remaining brewery of a once thriving industry was the Ambrose and Winslow Brewing Company. The building, however, had an active life after the brewing industry in Port Hope ceased. The former brewery building on Cavan Street had many lives after this stage, including Port Hope Brewing and Malting Company, Canadian Canners, and Stein Packers. As I mentioned a moment ago, a particularly famous name to be attached to the Port Hope brewing industry is Thomas Molson. Better known for his dealings in Kingston and Montreal with the Molson Brewing, Shipping, Hotel, and Banking Ventures, Thomas purchased a distillery in Port Hope, then known as Crawford's Distillery. In 1851, he purchased Brownstone Mills, which included a flour mill, sawmill, and another distillery. He later acquired yet another distillery located on Cavan Street in Port Hope. Thomas leased the distilleries and with his manager Robert Orr operated the flour and sawmills. He sold the flour on the Montreal Corn Exchange through brokers for export to England. Dividing his time between Port Hope and Montreal, Thomas married Sophia Stevenson in Port Hope in 1859, after the death of his first wife Martha 11 years prior. Molson's mills were listed in the Port Hope Directory for 1856, with R. Orr listed as agent. The mill building, which stands at the bottom of Hope Street North, remains and is currently used for an art school in the summer. It has a long and prominent history as an art school, but that's a better subject for another time. In 1858, Thomas Molson advised a distillery to let or rent on Cavan Street, stating, "To let, the distillery lately occupied by Mr. Edward Dodd in the town of Port Hope. It is capable of mashing 30 bushels daily and is driven by water power. No more convenient premises can be found, and all the whiskey can be sold on the spot without the cost of teaming. The above distillery has lately been refitted with all new utensils, and new and spacious auxsheds have been added. It is a desirable place for any man who wants to make money." Thomas Molson died on February 22, 1863. He is buried in the family Protestant cemetery at Mount Royal in Montreal. His son, William Markland Molson, inherited the Port Hope operation in 1863. In 1871, W. M. Molson is listed in the census as a miller on Cavan Street. Now let's get down to the more salacious history of the distilleries and Port Hope's harbor. Ontario was knee-deep in prohibition between the years of 1916 and 1927. However, because the province offered numerous exceptions to the rule, it opened the door to the very lucrative trade of rum running. The term rum running most likely originated from the start of Prohibition in the United States, when ships from the western Bahamas transported cheap Caribbean rum to Florida speakeasies. But rum's cheapness made it a low-profit item for the rum runners, and they soon moved on to smuggling Canadian whiskey, French champagne, and English gin to major cities like New York and Boston, where prices ran high. It was said that some ships carried up to $200,000 in contraband in a single run. An interesting distinction needs to be made between the term rum running and bootlegging. The term rum running is more commonly applied to smuggling over water, while bootlegging is applied to smuggling over land. According to an essay written by John S. Laurie in 1988, to help soothe the dry throats in America, the Canadian rum running business was born. The border between the U.S. and Canada became the main field of operations for running alcoholic beverages. This new business was risky but profitable, adventurous but dangerous. The alcohol arrived in Port Hope mostly aboard railroad boxcars, and the rum runners would hire local boys to help move the supply onto the boats. Young men would earn as much as $4 or $5 per weekend, which was substantial pay during the Great Depression. During this time, Mr. William Harvey was serving as harbor master for Port Hope. He was responsible for checking each ship leaving port and charging a stipend per case on behalf of the Harbor Commission. The government issued clearance for the export of alcohol to Cuba, even though the shipments were only expected to go straight across Lake Ontario. There were at least half a dozen boats involved in the rum running trade out of Port Hope, but the most effectively documented is the Mary H. The vessel was owned and operated by Mr. Hayden. It was equipped with 3 Liberty engines from World War I Martin bomber planes, with the exhaust designed to operate both under and above water, to facilitate silence and a smoke screen should the latter be required. While rum running was considered a legal gray area, it could also be very dangerous. It has been noted that one man working on a rum runner took the trip proceeds upon his return to Port Hope. He later disappeared, and his body was found near a lock in the Welland Canal several weeks later. Rum running is also noted to have occurred out of the Cobourg Harbor, but on a smaller scale than found at Port Hope. One particular rum runner working out of Cobourg was unable to make a delivery to the U.S. side of the lake and had to bring the load back to Cobourg. Since this was illegal, he was arrested by the Canadian authorities upon his return. When Prohibition ended in the U.S. in 1933, the rum running trade ground to a halt as well. John S. Laurie closes his essay by writing, "While the rum-running trade was at its height, a group of us young fellows would often be sitting at the end of the Port Hope East Pier in the dark of night, while the rum-runners were moving out of the harbor factitiously destined for Cuba. With the underwater exhaust on the Mary H., the only noise heard would be the swish of water as they nosed along. This busy alcoholic contraband trade left lasting memories of an exciting period in the history of the Port Hope Harbor. Please contact the Port Hope Archives at 905-885-1673 by email to archives@porthope.ca or drop on by 17 Milt Street North in Port Hope if you have any questions about industry, businesses, or agriculture in Port Hope.